Hello, everybody. There we are. Good evening, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Things came up. How is everybody today? You all good? Good work day. Good work day. Lots of interesting things, lots of things to do. But yeah, interesting times. So today I thought we're doing something different. Normally, we're doing this conversational thing. We're doing this conversational thing, which I love, which is pretty much why we have this podcast, right? To compare field notes. Today I want to do a little bit of a different agenda. I want to repeat a talk I gave before. Specifically, there's one. And this is a talk I gave last year in December at the Enter the Metaverse conference. And it's kind of an interesting one. So when we had the conversation with the organizers, I said, look, I can talk about kind of like ways to approach the metaverse and why the metaverse itself is complicated and things like essentially showing models how to approach the metaverse. I said, yeah, that's good. And well, I also could talk about what those kind of like based on a couple of assumptions where the opportunities are in the metaverse, because that's also kind of like not really clear. A lot of people ask all the time, what are the actual opportunities? And we had like not last stream, but the stream before that, we explicitly talked about different like quadrants in the metaverse roadmap where concrete opportunities are for businesses and brands, right? And I also said, yeah, we want that too. But I only had like a 30-minute time slot, which is 25 plus Q&A. So I took both my talks, which are usually half an hour, and I mushed them together. I had to throw out a lot and tried to create a coherent storyline around that, which was tricky. I cut a lot. And so even like during the conference, which was amazing, by the way. So before that, and this was kind of like my state of mind late last year, November, December, was like, I'm fed up with this metaverse stuff because the narrative goes into so many weird directions and it means everything and nothing. And for me, who worked in the space for quite a while, it was kind of annoying. And I was kind of like inward looking. I didn't actually want to participate. But then I did, and I was really glad I did because it was such a great conference, very inclusive. Like there were people from gaming, from like specific social virtual worlds where there designers, artists. It was such a great and overall inclusive event. I really, really enjoyed it. So it really gave me a lot of energy. And also, it's kind of like their fault that I not their fault, but like played an excellent part for me to get motivated again and also do the stream. So I really liked the event. And also the talk was very well received and people asked me, can I watch it again? And yes, of course you can watch it again if you actually participated in the event, but people who didn't participate cannot look at the recording. So a lot of people heard about this talk and I get asked all the time. So I thought I repeat it, but simply repeating it would be boring. So what we're doing is we get a director's cut, which I stuffed back in a couple of things I had to cut, which I think are relevant and interesting. And so what we're doing is actually talking about it. So that's the plan for today. And for those who know my talks, yes, this is a usual talk for me where I have, so even before I added slides, it was like 120, 125 slides for 30 minutes. And this is how I usually do things. It goes fast. It goes at a really quick pace. Not just because I had a lot of things to talk about and I mushed together two talks, but that would be my normal style. And right now I'm what, like 150? Hi, Clemens. So Clemens knows my talks. He knows what I'm talking about. Like we have 150 slides. And if I wanted to, I could probably do this in half an hour. But what I want to do is essentially talk about it. So what we probably want to do is go through section by section. And then I pause. You guys can ask questions if you want. Ideally, you ask questions right as I talk, and then I make specific pauses at the individual section, and then we go through the questions, right? If there are any. And then there will be a supercut, which will be also released as kind of like this half an hour I talk very fast, cut together as this is where people can actually go and listen to. So that's kind of the plan for today. But absolutely ask those questions because it's supposed to be a back and forth. What else? House rules. You should know them better. Yes, I work for Microsoft on Metaverse things. No, we're not going to talk about Microsoft. This is a private project. I'm not going to answer questions around Microsoft, and I'm not going to pitch you Microsoft products. I would like you to extend the same courtesy. Please don't post like product pitches in chat, like product links, other things. Let's have a civilized conversation. Speaking of civilized, I know that some of this stuff I'm going to say will be provoking, maybe. You might not like some of the contents, and that's perfectly fine. Let's argue about it. Let's discuss it. Absolutely share your view on things, but keep it civilized and respectful. So that's the second rule. So this is a private thing. Don't pitch your stuff and be respectful. That's the house rules. And with that, let's go colorful. And let's see where, ding, there we are. So, hi, my name is Dirk. This is the talk, Approaching the Metaverse for Businesses and Brands. And this is pretty much what I do, right? Or at least how we like to show it. So I do work for Microsoft on strategic development and acceleration of the metaverse, specifically working around Internet of Things and mixed reality. But again, to repeat that, I want to have some fun with this talk. So while I do work for Microsoft, ideas and opinions in the talk are my own, and I do not speak for the company. And I have been in the space for around 11-ish years, working on brand and experience side of things. I did, for example, start in AAA games, but then I worked for a digital agency called Razorfish, especially in emerging experiences. And then we worked for digital retail, theme parks, hotels, casinos, city-scale digital infrastructures. And then kind of like on the enterprise and industry side of things, so in mobility, manufacturing, logistics, and fashion. And the best way to describe my world, what I actually do, is that I help clients explore potential futures, understand their impact, identify desirable futures, and then make those actionable with roadmaps, milestones, and clear next steps. And today I want to talk about two things that will explore different ways to approach the metaverse. And I want to start with the question why the metaverse as a concept is confusing and why defining it is even more confusing. And then I want to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty and look at some ways to get from confusion to opportunity. So let's start by outlining the metaverse, what the metaverse is. Let's start with the news that you've probably read this morning, where The metaverse is about 3D avatars, it's about immersive meetings and digital collectibles and VR games, virtual content creation and entertainment and stuff like that. And all of that is kind of true, but it really just describes technologies. It doesn't really capture possibilities and the overall spirit of it. It's just specific aspects. And then you go to the next website or news site and where all NFTs are scams, crypto is pretty much a Ponzi scheme. And by the way, Facebook's metaverse is looking like a dystopia. And that might also be true, but it's still not really helpful. It's just a flip side, where previously we talked about hype and now we turn it into hysteria. And then the next article mentions studies and reports, and they all go a little like this, where this is the year where it really starts. And in 3 years, you will be making loads of money. And obviously that stuff is maybe a little less true. But sometimes it's funny to read these 3-year-old reports that claim you should already be a billionaire. And even worse, these narratives are largely driven by financial incentives and stakeholders. And these people spend a lot of time telling you that their version of the metaverse is the real one. So some groups would attach the term to specific technologies, for example, virtual reality, augmented reality, or blockchain. And the reason they do so is because they're investing in it or working in those technologies. Others see it as a future vision or narrative, sometimes dystopian, sometimes utopian, and usually because they subscribe or detest the respective ideologies. And some groups talk about the coming metaverse, usually if they're still working on their products, and others argue that it already exists if they already sell a product. In other words, it is about my metaverse, and that's the real one because that's what I work on and what I've invested in. And none of that is helpful. The way metaverse is currently used by the media, by analysts, and sadly by us in the industry, is not really helping to provide clarity on what the metaverse even is, what it will enable, and what the specific opportunities are. So we're cherry picking to shout either overly positive projections or shout horrible hysteria into the void. And while all of it might have a grain of truth, it does not necessarily reflect what's going on in the space. So what is the metaverse then? Well, remember I said I've been doing this for quite a while now? Besides the metaverse becoming a hype now, it's been around for a very, very long time in a more actuated form. Only previously, we mostly talked about social virtual worlds. Let me explain. Fundamentally, social virtual worlds are all systems where people act with a platform, spatially or contextually, interacting with the platform and with each other. A little bit more tangibly, it defines your identity in a world. This is you and your representation. It locates you contextually. This might be your location, or it might be other things like time or membership, right? I am here. It's almost 7 p.m. So the reason why I'm here is contextually 7 p.m. And here is, in that case, YouTube. And it allows you to interact with the system based on your identity and context. You're watching my stream because I'm able to do so because it's 7 p.m. and we started at 6:30 p.m. And others can see that interaction. Likewise, you can see there. Congratulations, dear chat. You're in a social virtual world with me. And this covers, for example, multi-user dungeons, which is essentially an early form of massive multiplayer games, but text-based. It also covers up to 3D massive multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft. It covers multi-user shooters like Fortnite, but also sandboxes and collaborative spaces like Minecraft. And in 2006, a lot of smart people got invited to an exercise in the Institute for the Future to explore paths into a 3D metaverse. Essentially, they wanted to know what happens when these social virtual worlds meet real maps of the planet, and what happens when simulations in those virtual worlds get real and life and business go virtual. And this is the model they came up with, again, in 2006. They looked at what was back then virtual worlds and divided them into 2 dimensions based on identity-focused individuals looking outward into the world and world-focused, the world looking inwards towards individuals. And then it's real world and people interacting in the real world with digital augmentation and constructed worlds where it is all a simulation. And this is a super interesting model where they essentially named the quadrants: virtual worlds, mirror worlds, augmented realities, and live logging. And virtual worlds are platforms where virtual identities explore fictional virtual maps. For example, a virtual character running around in a meeting room, or a virtual character running around in Azeroth in World of Warcraft, or a map in Fortnite or Minecraft. You know, the examples previously. And this is what we usually think when we think metaverse. But let's imagine we swap out the virtual map, the fictional map, with a map of the real world. And then you get mirror worlds, where an abstraction of you travels the real world. This is essentially the reconstruction of the real world as a simulation. Digital twins is usually another word we use for this. And you can explore parts of the world that you're not currently present. For example, an avatar of you running around in a real map of New York in Google Earth or Google Street View. But also all other forms of abstracted maps of the real world that you act on with an avatar of yourself. For example, a dot representing you moving in Google Maps or in Uber. Technically and conceptually, both are the same. In one case, you move around a fictional map, and the other one you move around in a real map. But you can also get rid of the map entirely and project everything onto reality. Right? If you previously had a simulation of a machine that you got real data for, now you're scaling the map in 1-to-1 size and you align it to reality, and suddenly you can see the digital data, the digital representation and simulation of that machine on the machine itself. And of course, in this scenario, you act as yourself, as a real person moving around in reality. Again, it's the same thing. You just switched the map data, or rather, you scaled the real world map data on 1-to-1 size. And finally, that brings me to the last quadrant, which augments the representation of the individual, not just the map. So in 2006, live logging became a thing, and today we know people augmenting themselves into characters as social media influencers. Technically and conceptually, all of these things are the same thing. You just moved from augmenting the world to augmenting the image of a real person. And it doesn't really matter if this is for private context or for an industrial context. And this is also very interesting. The question of identity is very interesting here, since you represent yourself differently on Facebook than, for example, on Teams or on LinkedIn. Right? So you do have different representations of yourself in different virtual spaces. And you can look at the requirements for such metaverses and eventually end up with the requirements for social virtual worlds. You do all that, congratulations, you are in the metaverse. And you can think of all of these as contextual, transparent, multi-user systems. So yes, these attributes describe Minecraft and Google Maps and Pokemon Go and Facebook, and pull them all into the metaverse. Really, the only difference between Minecraft and Google Street View is that one map is based on a fictional world and the other is based on a real one. The only difference between Uber and Pokemon Go is pretty much the type of things they spawn on their maps. And Twitter is also just a massive multiplayer game, but they only bothered to develop the chat part. Social virtual worlds are very early realized that they're not imaginary. People bring real world value along with them when they enter virtual worlds. As Dr. Richard Bartle wrote in his book Designing Virtual Worlds in 2006, we didn't bring a little bit of the virtual into the real. We brought all of reality into the virtual when we engage with these virtual worlds. And Rev Costa observed that, well, if that's the case, that virtuality is real world value, there's kind of like a tipping point where there's so much real world value within the virtual that they cannot be meaningfully separated anymore. Shut down the virtual and reality won't work for some anymore. Like some modern organizations can't exist without their digital resources. And at this point, if this happens on society scale, the metaverse will emerge. There's also what the Metaverse roadmap called the Metaverse Duality. The term Metaverse refers to both a set of technologies as well as a narrative. And this is similar to the internet, which describes a set of technologies like ESA OSI model, network cards, but also HTTP protocols. But it also acts as a narrative and a set of expectations around capabilities and digital transformation. And both aspects provide value to specific stakeholders. So one example where actuation would be use cases that are typically part of the digital transformation journey, targeted at the core business of an organization, influencing, for example, profit and profitability. For example, use immersive training to increase operational efficiency within a factory. Do safe training in virtual reality instead of a potentially dangerous space. Use cases are typically, for inspiration, part of PR or marketing efforts. And they target the beta of an organization to influence the brand, growth, and risk. So for example, mention that your organization does something with the metaverse to attract new capital or talent. And both use the same term for metaverse, but totally different purposes and goals, and usually people within an organization. One is asking the question, how do we use the metaverse to improve the core business? And others are asking, how do we use the metaverse to improve our image in the market? One is looking externally and the other one is looking internally, and both have meaning. And the metaverse is really all of this and more. It spans from people to things to environments to worlds, regardless of if they are fully virtual or digital physical or fully physical. Another way to look at what the metaverse is to actually look at it. Future visions are something that haven't existed as a real product yet. However, the concept or principle is known and understood and accepted on a society level. Pop culture artifacts like books and movies and TV series are usually a large driver of these visions. And those visions will inevitably inspire and influence public expectations and thus investors and thus the end product. So to understand the metaverse further, it's really interesting to look at these visions. And to be fair, these are just 3 examples of future visions around the metaverse. You can find a lot of them on YouTube, and they're very similar. But if you look at these visions, you can think about what kinds of technologies do they show? In what of the metaverse quadrants would you see their scenarios? And looking at these visions, most of them show a world where digital augmentation reaches into the physical world, and also where all 4 quadrants are used, sometimes jumping from one or the other. So it seems like it almost works like a customer journey where they start in one touch point and eventually travel through other touch points. And in this case, it starts within one metaverse quadrant and eventually goes through all the other quadrants, and it unfolds as it makes sense. And that makes sense since no trend and no vision, and indeed none of these metaverse quadrants can exist in isolation. Pop culture is influenced by technology, and also it influences technology. And one way to look at this is to imagine that technology, society, and environments behave kind of like pressure, temperature, and volume in a gas. If you change one of them, the others have to change too. For example, if you change the environment and go to the moon, literally, the environment will be very, very different. And you need new technologies to survive, but also likely new forms of society if you want to stay there and stay safe. If new technologies come along, like in the Industrial Revolution, societies will change, but it also has an effect on our environments, for example, city planning and mobility. And finally, looking at different countries, societies do have different values and thus make decisions which technologies they embrace and how to shape their environments. And this is why visions like Ready Player One won't happen, because the metaverse won't be isolated within one paradigm or quadrant. It doesn't make sense to have this advanced technology in one aspect of your life and not in any other. I mean, obviously they have very, very advanced virtual reality and haptic systems, but they can't seem to be able to build a simple cleaning robot. And they're able to manufacture all those technical gadgets in a very efficient and cheap way so that everybody can use it. But then they're not able to produce cheap IKEA furnitures to act. It doesn't make sense. It's a nice approach to fiction as a narrative device, just not a realistic one. That picture would be like smartphones evolving exactly to the iPhone 13, but you can only use it when you're sitting at home. And the most popular game is to see who can sit down the fastest, and then you get a virtual car or something. It doesn't make sense. Progress in one aspect of the metaverse will also affect and enable other aspects and the other quadrants. And these visions show progress across all these 4 quadrants of the metaverse roadmap. Looking at them, you can ask questions like, how do people interact with technology? What kinds of societies do the people exist in? And what does this mean for the environments? And looking at the visions again, they also create other interesting questions. Mostly, where does this data actually come from? How was it collected? And if this data represents the state of the real world, what will happen if you interact with that data? If you change a value? Does that change in the virtual world propagate into the real world? And what will happen if you change data representing other people? And those kind of questions are usually associated with the paradigm of ambient computing, meaning the digitalization of physical space. Remember when I talked in the beginning about digital experiences in retail, hotels, casinos, cities, industries? All of that is being subsumed into these metaverse quadrants right now. And I get it. That makes it even more complicated to explain what the metaverse is, and I'm sorry. And at this point, the best definition seems to include 2 huge megatrends, each with dozens of large subtrends and even more moving parts. So how can this even lead to a coherent system? And the answer is, it probably won't. And that's fine. After all, GeoCities was the first big glimpse of what the web is, and it was super messy, but also really awesome. It was really the entry point for a lot of people, allowed everybody to have their first voice on the web and be creative and fun. And it paved the way for the web we now know. But it started with a lot of blinking text, ugly GIFs, and just generally what we would consider now bad taste. And the point is, the first step in understanding the true potential of the metaverse is to give up on those artificial moats around your specific precious definition of the metaverse and allow some chaos and blinking text. It won't be just one thing or the other. It won't be VR or AR, headsets or phones, real or virtual, trustless or your lawyers. The answer will be yes. And it's confusing, I understand, but it's also diverse and fun and full of opportunity. So, as I said, the attempt of defining the metaverse might be confusing, but there are ways to approach it and get from confusion to opportunity. One way of approaching the opportunities of the metaverse is to look at the individual components, because if the whole thing is too big and messy, we can dissect the metaverse into, for example, social and technological components and look at them individually. For example, by looking at specific subtrends to then see how they affect, interact, and enable social virtual worlds, and thus the metaverse, and how they will make it scale. And a way to approach the individual components is to ask why they exist in the first place. Are they driven by society, by the environments, or by other technologies? How mature are they? What will accelerate them and what will slow them down? And all these questions will act as a kind of lens through which you can view the world and make assumptions and predictions around scenarios and opportunities. And I want to make clear that these are really assumptions and predictions. There are many models and frameworks representing different lenses through which we're to explore these potential futures. And so right now, let's look at the interplay of trends with social virtual worlds based on the Metaverse roadmap. Let's start with the foundational technology, the Internet of Things, aka where do we get all this data from? The driver for IoT is simple, it's economics, it's cheaper. To explain this one, I usually ask a very simple question. Please go online and find the cheapest printer you can buy. And chances are you will come up with something like this, and it has a color touchscreen, it is Wi-Fi enabled, it can print, it can scan, it can fax, it probably has apps. So how come this is so cheap? In fact, this is cheaper than a printer that can just print and does not have all those other shiny features. And the reason that this printer is essentially is so cheap is essentially it's a smartphone. At least the components inside the printer are the same as in a smartphone. Because you have the rule of scale in production, which means the more you produce of something, the cheaper it gets. And since smartphones are produced to scale, their components are very, very cheap to buy. Cheaper, in fact, than creating custom printer components developed from scratch. But as smartphones components also come with capabilities like connecting to the network, touch input, image recording, all these things, you will also get these capabilities for free in your products. And this is true for pretty much everything with some kind of electronics inside. Fridges, toothbrushes, cars, it doesn't really matter what it is. Scale components are cheaper than bespoke ones. And yes, of course, there will always be a professional and luxury segment doing their own thing, creating their own chips and components, but scale technology will bow to price, especially these days when production and supply chain is difficult. And you cannot escape this rule of scale. At one point, certain components will be so cheap that you'll just use them for everything. Watches, cameras, pretty much everything in your bag. And at this point, you could argue that nobody needs a smart fridge, a smart toilet, or smart toothbrush, and certainly not a smart hairbrush, and other small, insignificant, mundane little things. But the discussion is pointless. Smartphones will set the pace, mundane things will follow, because that's the cheapest and easiest way to design and produce things. So, the Internet of Things adds digital capabilities and ultimately behaviors to physical things. And this will include everything that can in any way, shape or form be digitized. If it has electrical components, it will eventually be a connected device. However, if that's the case, new opportunities will emerge if everything that can be digital is digital and collects data. You remember the headlines that data is the new oil? Well, that kind of happened, but very selectively. And people noticed that while having data is good, understanding data is better, and utilizing data is best. So the whole notion of big data as just collecting as much data as possible has turned into searching for data services and utilizing them to do more. And institutions started giving their data away for others to do things with. In this example, this is the data APIs from Schiphol, Amsterdam Airport, that you can use to build on top of, which is a win-win for both parties. And by doing that, they essentially created a mirror world of Schiphol Airport. And the handbag full of digitally enhanced things? Well, if we assume they all sense their environment and collect a lot of data, it makes sense that they offer some kind of service or API as well. In a way, this turns all devices into little data service websites, the kind of geo-cities of things, if you like. But you usually have a crappy smartphone app that you get with your cheap e-toy. And it's a wild collection of messy, unorganized, unstructured data pools, not really user-friendly, but interesting data nonetheless. And that's not just true for things, but also the environment. So this is an example by the MIT Sensible Lab. And they added a number of sensors to public city vehicles. They use garbage trucks. But they collected a number of environmental data. Pretty much like the famous Google cars, only cheaper and different data. And this continues. And as it continues, we get more and more Google Maps type location-based data. However, instead of streets, they show current temperature at specific street corners, or loudness, or air quality, or particles. And they create all these values for a different mirror world. And the idea is really that people and companies will pick up on the individual specialized data sets and create value out of them, combine them, put them into bigger contexts, and create new kind of services and value chains and experiences, and create new mirror world front ends out of this. But this is not just interesting for thing companies leveraging thing data. One or two companies will emerge as a kind of like infrastructure for those thing data companies. Because if you have semi-structured data pools randomly distributed and it takes somebody to make sense out of it, you need somebody to make it usable. Just like Google emerged from the early internet catalogs and made the web searchable and accessible. Somebody will make things in and environmental data and all that mirror world data searchable and accessible. And this also requires turning foundational technologies like blockchain into much more approachable platforms, getting rid of current limitations and issues, most likely evolving them into like not technically blockchain, but similar in spirit and more practical. And this is an opportunity to map the space of mirror worlds and emerge as the dominant search engine and enabler in this quadrant. Next up, we have cognitive services, or really applied machine learning. These services range from voice recognition, speech analysis, language understanding, visual understanding, object recognition, those kind of things. And we need them to fix a complexity issue. Because as things get more and more digital, they get more and more complex as well. If we look at the state of home automation, we replace our simple analog light switch with a digital button to control the digital light bulbs. But then we replace the digital button with a lot of buttons because digital light bulbs can do more than just turn on and off. And since we didn't have more room, we replaced the lots of buttons with a glass surface to display even more buttons. So look, now we replace the lots of buttons plus glass with digital assistants to make them simple again. Because look at it. Who wants to use an interface like this? It's nice that the light switch evolved into something smart with smartphone-like capabilities over time, but it's just not practical, even if it's inevitable. What we actually want is to have something simple, to get back to a single button that does whatever. Like your own personal digital assistants that you can use for mostly digital things that can be done digitally. Only you won't necessarily talk to a person, but to whatever digitally enabled device will be around you. Your phone, your Echo, your fridge, your toothbrush, and then they do it. And this applies for virtual spaces too. For example, recently in Minecraft, the community was asked which feature to include next. And what the community asked for was essentially an assistant to help them pick stuff up because item collection became tedious in the game. As well as influencing physical environments. Because do you think autonomous cars will be the only things that move around? Everything that can move will be autonomous because everything will be digital. So cognitive services will support people to be able to interact with things in a natural way as scenarios get too complicated to understand. But the implication here is that it doesn't really matter in which quadrant individual participants live. And what I mean with that is we won't necessarily be able to differentiate between a concierge and a digital assistant, or between a human front desk worker and a bot, or a dog and a fridge. It's kind of like this example by Google a couple of years ago. It was an example of the Google Assistant calling a human in a hair salon to negotiate an appointment. And that's all well and good until you realize humans are just expensive bot conversation endpoints at this point. As bots will be able to converse with humans, the expensive, inefficient element becomes the human itself. And you immediately created another opportunity to optimize and replace that with a bot as well. So strip that away and you're left with just digital agents having conversations with each other, managing, planning, and organizing on behalf of their individuals or organizations. Things just become another augmentation of users, identities, and organizations. And as they learn to achieve goals more and more gracefully, they will use different platforms and communication channels to get there. So, this begs the question, what would be the future platform to not only allow humans to interact, but also facilitate human-machine and machine-to-machine communication? Ideally, this is seamless and neither party cares nor notices how artificial or real the other endpoint is. What we now call smart contracts will only be a small part of this, as we need to jump out and connect all quadrants. In other words, what's the Facebook of things? How do things augment users in reaching their goals? And if you have an answer to that, you can pretty much own this quadrant. But if all the above is true, we require a digital physical infrastructure. And before we had economics and usability as drivers, but computational graphs are like a contextual necessity for all of the above. The best way to explain this one is that it requires context to turn the Internet of Things into the Internet of my things, to allow me have a place in that mirror world. And if we really talk about an augmentation of me, a system needs to know who I am and what context I'm in. In other words, it needs to be my milk, my images, and my content. And only then can things and places really react to me, be it proactive or reactive. And graphs allow to generate personalized scenarios based on these contexts. And this applies to virtual, physical, and mixed environments. Here's a good example by Mercedes-Benz. So if people get into their car, and as soon as they do that, the car knows who they are, and then it personalizes itself based on the driver and the passenger. But beyond that, how about the car knows how you slept by getting data from your health and fitness app and recognizes that you don't feel well, maybe recognizes that you have an important meeting in your calendar coming up? Could and should all that influence, for example, the seat setting or the temperature or the ride softness, or even like your navigational system to take the scenic route? And strange things are happening when digitally enhanced objects interact with us in a direct, embedded, and relatable way. And here are two examples. One very low tech, and this one is very high tech. And by displaying some form of personality, things become relatable. They develop character. And we as humans are wired to anthropomorphize vaguely intelligent entities, especially if we don't understand them fully. We do it with living things like pets, but also with inanimate objects like dolls or cars. We give them names, we plead with them if they don't work, and sometimes we form these weird rituals around them. Like, for example, juggling your keys before starting your car because that makes it start faster or something. So what would happen if objects could actually sense their environment, are aware of their context, and are able to understand and engage and interact with people in that way? Well, we know what will happen because we've seen this, for example, with Jaibo. This was a social home robot, and it was designed to use relationship as an interface, and people started throwing birthday parties for it. They took it on their vacations, they brought it to their graduations. In other words, if your interface is a personality, then the user experience is really a relationship with a thing. And for brands, this means something very, very powerful. You can now shape the experience you want people to have with your products. Going back to Mercedes, for example, what do you think the personality should be of these two car models? They do not look the same. They certainly do not drive the same, so why should they have the same personalities in their digital assistants? And in the real world, why should their driver, assistant, and autonomous systems behave the same? And in virtual worlds, why should their digital representation behave the same? We will project certain expectations based on the embodiment of brands. And essentially, this means you need to train the products around the brand values and identities because they become a representative of it. So those parameters have to be carefully designed not to alienate the users, as well as to promote and foster actual relationship between users and products and brands. In this case, alienate means that the personality, meaning an interface to a product or service, behaves differently than expected and becomes an anti-pattern. And this is what I call relationship design. These parameters have to be carefully designed to not alienate users, as well as to promote and foster actual relationships. And this also means training things around brand values and identity. That goes for the personality and tonality of the object, as well as the behavior, regardless in which quadrant you act. You will not be able to sensibly separate physical product design and digital product design and product support and branding and marketing in a future metaverse scenario. Relationships matter regardless if they live in physical space or in digital space. And this type of relationship design is currently bleeding into the AR quadrant and will likely be a new type of digital capability. It's very likely that this will spawn new types of consultancies and agencies, and these teams would help and design the dynamics between user and object, between brands and consumer, between buyer and product. And they essentially empower objects with personality to make technology more personal and magical for people. And they shape the relationship between people and environments. But there's a problem. Well, many problems actually, but one of the biggest problems is that dynamically changing environments where you don't understand the rules and cannot control what is happening are a very bad idea. Like, if you remember the grand staircase in Harry Potter, it would change all the time, even as people went up and down. It's a labyrinth as a utility, which again is a great plot device, but it really sucks in reality. But this is really what mixed reality is about. If digital dimensions become so complex and able to influence the real, then we need a way to know what's going on. The more immersive, the better. And usually with mixed reality, you will see pictures like this. They showcase the ability to see into these virtual worlds, to see volumetric holographic representations of things within your reality integrated into the perception of the environment. And while that in itself is very powerful, the real fun starts if we add abilities of all other quadrants. As everything becomes digital, with digital abilities sending data to these mirror worlds, we create those digital ghost dimensions. And although they're invisible and unsensible for normal senses, abstract, we're searching for ways to now make them sensible, giving us superpowers to look and interact with these digital dimensions. And in this simple example, we can see we visualized Wi-Fi connectivity as a digital overlay, and the warmer the color, the better reception you have. And in industrial use cases, we see the inside these machines, what they're doing, how fast they are rotating, their temperature, and we can look back in time at their manuals and service records, and to an extent, we can even look forward in time by simulating and predicting their performance and maintenance cycles. And this goes beyond just headsets. Remember, digitally augmented things, every object will have digital capabilities and thus integrate itself into a digital environment. For example, physical paper where you can share or print contents, or physical paper with e-ink capabilities where you can connect a physical keyboard and type. So as technology evolves, future experiences will be able to cover the entire spectrum of mixed reality, from augmented reality to virtual reality and everything in between. So at that moment, for this task, what is the best quadrant to transport a specific experience? And maybe it's an experience that starts within one quadrant and moves between as the use case unfolds. And as our data moves seamlessly between the metaverse quadrants, we need an immersive way to understand them, to look and interact with the digital twin dimension. And this really is the experience aspect of things. So yeah, finally, we got to headsets and VR and AR and 3D and game technologies and all that. But as you can see, it's literally kind of the tip of the iceberg, the method by which we fully utilize the underlying infrastructure. So, to sum it all up, we can look at the metaverse as a combination of ambient computing and social virtual worlds. We can segment the metaverse landscape into 4 quadrants based on world-focused versus identity-focused and real-world versus constructed worlds. We can map ambient computing against the metaverse quadrants to identify what needs to happen and fully utilize the potential. And now we can have a look at experiences and solutions and platforms and assess the maturity and trajectory of those. Also, you can look at white spaces and gaps. But the thing is, I want you to remember is that fundamentally all these quadrants are the metaverse. They are the same from a conceptual and a technical point of view. More importantly, the reason why social virtual worlds and the metaverse can be defined so broadly is that they follow the same rules for social dynamics. The people using those are the same, and they use them the same way. People don't really care if the world they interact with is fully virtual, digital physical, or fully physical. The effects on their body chemistry is the same. That means that the methods and mechanics to design these spaces is largely the same, or at least transferable between the 4. And as virtual spaces crash into the real space, people will try and game reality for fun and profit. Like the Russian bots we see on Twitter, abusing Facebook algorithms for reach and manipulating opinions. Yeah, gamers in the online games have been doing that for a very long time, and game designers have predicted this behavior in social worlds long before Cambridge Analytica or the 2016 election. And the Metaverse roadmap even predicted the model. I hate to tell you this, but play to earn is nothing new. We have called this having a job for quite a while now. And there's no difference just because the interface is more colorful than Outlook. Even the canonical book about this is from 2003. Author and journalist Julian Dibble decided to quit his job for a year and make a living buying and selling virtual loot in EverQuest, and documented the whole thing. His blog is still online. He turned it into a book looking at the entire subculture as well as how it deals with real implications like paying taxes. And we've looked deeply into how virtual world economies work way before Second Life and certainly way before new versions like Axie, Sandbox or Decentraland. We know what works and what doesn't. And more importantly, we know why it works and the differences between real and virtual economies. Because we also have a deep exploration and research into the motivation of players, why they enter social virtual worlds. The earliest one was Richard Bartle's Taxonomy of Players, which he updated in his 2006 book, Designing Virtual Worlds, also looking at how motivation changes over time and how they can purposefully support or discourage by design. We know how this stuff works for a very long time, and it doesn't matter if you build a penis out of dirt in Minecraft or make videos of penis-shaped clouds in YouTube or write 4 pages of penis fan art in Facebook, or maybe people plotting penis routes on Google Maps. It's all the same. It's griefing behavior. If you have users interact with each other, you will also have abusers, what Bartle called killers. It doesn't matter how many degrees you abstract a virtual representation, and if you attach value to that representation, or any other form of incentive, the abuse matters. And people will not only do it for fun, but also scale it and monetize it. Ad click farms on Facebook are the same as comment bots on Amazon. They're the same as gold farming bots in every MMO. And they're the same as other people leveling your virtual pet for you. There are ways to automate the value generation on the respective social virtual world. Because remember this, systems that influence the physical world also influence society. You either do it on purpose or you will do it by accident, in an unconscious way that also leaves room for malicious actors. Because, for example, I'm sure that Pokemon Go didn't mean to be racist and classist, but it was, basing initial locations of spawn on maps that favored white, rich neighborhoods. I mean, look at this picture. You see the metaverse? I see somebody really thought it was a good idea to community manage downtown San Francisco during a pandemic. Honestly, I'm just glad that Pokemon Go wisely chose a positive sum economy, because I can guarantee you, if there was only one Charizard NFT to be collected that day by the first player, I assume there would have been real fighting, not just virtual one. So yeah, Niantic did a lot of things right, but had issues that shouldn't have happened in the first place. And this explains the negative sides of the metaverse. This is how you get influencers and scamming their communities, how rug pulls happen. This is how you get trustless technology used by people that shouldn't be trusted. This is why it's a bad idea to make the users the product, because it's a great way to incentivize people making money by objectifying other people. People will weaponize the metaverse for fun, but mostly for profit, if you give them the opportunity. And the actual hard part of the metaverse is also a governance one. In other words, social problems are currently much harder to state and solve than technical aspects. Besides manipulation, it raises questions around accessibility. When digital channels that can manipulate the physical world are only usable by specific groups. And if we want to change the dynamics between platforms, producers and consumers, we need to think about governance of the space. This is not a technical problem, it's a social and systems problem. So, I hope this was a helpful model how to approach the metaverse, a relatable model how to think about big potential opportunities, and I hope I scared you just enough to make you stop and think if you really want to be the one owning a quadrant. Because very likely you will end up with responsibilities very, very similar to a government. And almost certainly you will be regulated by one. And as we build the metaverse, you might not actually care for every aspect. You might not even agree or like every aspect. You can be critical of some and hype for others. And that's fine, as long as you realize that your specific technology and aspect does not live in isolation. The thing you work on will be just one aspect and one enabler, and it will enable others. But that's diversity and inclusiveness for you, because who are we actually building all this stuff for? I hope we do it for everybody, enabling every person, thing, and space around the planet to enter the metaverse and achieve more. So they can leave their mark and add their voice and bring their best selves and identities. And yeah, hopefully they will also bring their chrome horses and raccoon animations and blinking text and memes and JPEGs and dances and bad lyrics and fanfiction. Because I think that another GeoCities moment in the metaverse to start it off would be pretty awesome. Thank you and take care. See, wasn't so hard. It took way longer than half an hour. It was a good idea to cut most of it for the 30 minutes talk. So nice. I have a talk I can share on YouTube. Hopefully that will stop asking people, hey, can you share the talk? There you go. But I will cut it up and release it as a probably single video. But I think it kind of encapsulates a lot that we've talked about in the previous episodes. Around how do I actually see these things coming together, and also an outlook into how I see the space. Clemens, that was Julian Dibble. Give me a sec. That's the book, Play Money. I think I talked about him last time during the economy talk as well. Let me see. Julian Dibble. And where's his blog / Play Money, right? Yep. There we go. So that's the website. And this is the blog, juliandibble.com/playmoney. And if you don't want to buy the book, here's the entire blog, like where he started in the beginning. And he like tried to blog every day, like what happens in little snippets. He made his first eBay sale. Yay, a rune book, getting $1.99. And he documents like every day what he made. It's an interesting read in blog form. If you can get the book, because it's way more structured, but also it goes into also way more details and background and kind of like talking about the people he met. I think that the end total was, let me see. I think it was around 35,000 he made in that year. But it's a super interesting project. Yeah, let me check. No, profits 11,000. So profit. And it's from 2003. So it's super early. And essentially you can just project it. It's like exactly the same, but it shows how virtual, like actual real value extended into social virtual worlds. And of course, everybody knew it. And at the same time, Edward Castronova wrote about, what was this paper about? I think lineage. But he wrote an amazing paper where he looked at certain virtual worlds and the economy. And he noticed, hey, actually, there's a lot of money going around. Let me check virtual world economies. And he also wrote about about EverQuest, and he noted that the GDP of EverQuest was higher than that of Russia, and a player could make an average income of $5 per hour. That was in 2007. And essentially, okay, the kind of like minimum income, minimum wage in this world is $5, which at that time was totally unthinkable in 2007. And this was where like a couple of economy professors took note and were like, seriously? And you're like, yeah. And this is so funny when people now talk about play to earn. I just point to the book and say, yeah, we know. For about 2 decades now. We even have the studies and papers to back it up. This also was, there was this article by Yanis Varoufakis in going around where he looked at, okay, what is this like blockchain crypto Web3 promise actually? And I said, yeah, well, at Valve, and also he ran an economy of Greece. At Valve, we know this stuff is known. This won't work. Yeah, people will kill it. And this is also why I say, if Pokemon Go actually used NFTs and only one person could get a Pikachu, people will start killing each other. At least hurting each other and stealing phones and things. It was a very good idea to have a positive sum economy in that game, because otherwise it would be very bad, and also it wouldn't scale. But this is kind of like the issue I see with the Decentraland and the Sandbox and closed economies with fixed resources. I just don't think it makes sense. It just invites problems. And as we see, if you go through Reddit or look at sandbox NFT stealing, it's rampant. People just steal NFTs left and right. And that might be in-game items, it might be land, it doesn't matter. There's no security in there, which is going to be very interesting until the first like really high end, like if somebody steals the Adidas land or the land of Atari, suddenly they will be returned. And suddenly they will change the internal server code to, oh no, this is not an NFT anymore. This is like they bought it. Sorry, we're rolling this back. If their biggest investors are getting scammed too, and eventually they will roll stuff back and suddenly say, oh no, we're not using the blockchain anymore for specific parts. This is the elite part of the world that is not driven by NFT, but it has specific ownership. So this is only a matter of time. More tea. Yep. NFTs are essentially a link. Mostly. The issue here is that the world compute. So the issue is that computing power and space on the blockchain is very, very expensive. And so you cannot, you're technically not able to store a picture. And so what you do is you store a link and then the picture is actually somewhere else. If you're lucky, it's on something like that's kind of similar to a P2P network, IPFS. But usually it just resides on any server. And usually the stuff on MetaMask is actually hosted by Google. So if you actually send down a takedown message to Google, they will take down the NFT and you just lost the NFT, but you still own the link on the blockchain, which does make sense. And also the compute power of the blockchain is just abysmal. Like if you pay the theoretical maximum of Ethereum in terms of abilities is something like a 5,000th, 1/5,000th of a Raspberry Pi. And you pay $250 a second to utilize that quote power. So this world computer pretty much sucks in terms of actual computation. So you cannot store anything, you cannot compute anything. So the things need to be very efficient, which most of the time means error prone. And this is how hacks happen. I mean, technically, if you believe that code is law, there are no hacks, because people just utilize the smart contracts in a way that weren't thought of. For example, hey, if I send amount 0 to this smart contract, he will actually think, well, 0 times the price equals 0, so the price is 0. That was the most recent hack in some of the NFTs. So congratulations, your smart contract just gave something out for free. If you said I'm buying 0 things, and since it's not fungible, I'm getting one anyway. So yeah, weird. And all of this is totally unnecessary. Like this, the only reason for this is an arbitrary design decisions by people to keep it that way. Otherwise, we could have way more efficient, way more storage, and way cheaper and way less energy waste. And that is called cloud computing. But that's not cool. That's not a good narrative. VCs don't like it because blockchain, cool, money. So weird. Yeah. So, although this was a certainly interesting week, it was a very taxing week as well. And I'm pretty tired. So, thank you so much for participating. Thank you for watching. If you do not watch this live and watch this after the fact, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Especially like if you made it through the 2 hours. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Especially these days. I hope you have a as good as it can be weekend. I hope you have a great week afterwards. I hope you stay safe. I hope you stay safe. I hope you take care. And yeah, thanks for sticking around. Thanks for this little escapism. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Clemens. And yeah, have a good weekend. See you, everybody.